For decades, the story of Australia's wildlife crisis had a clear villain. Scientists knew it. Rangers knew it. The data confirmed it. If you wanted to understand why Australia had the worst mammal extinction rate on Earth, you followed the feral cat. Everything pointed the same direction. The maps, the stomach contents, the population surveys, the extinction records, all of it converged on the same animal, and the answer felt settled, final, the kind of scientific consensus you don't expect to get complicated. Then, something started happening in the parts of Australia where cats were supposed to be thriving, something that the models didn't predict, something that the people who'd spent their careers studying Australian predators hadn't quite anticipated. In areas where you'd expect a feral cat to be untouchable at the top of the local food chain, something was changing its behavior, shifting its schedule, making it nervous. And here's what makes it genuinely strange. The animal doing it had been gone from mainland Australia for 3,000 years. If this is the kind of story you come here for, wildlife, ecology, mysteries with scientific complexity that hasn't been fully resolved, subscribe now, because this one is still playing out in real time and you'll want to be here for what comes next. Let's start with the scale of the problem, because without understanding how bad it got, the significance of what's changing doesn't land the way it should. Feral cats arrived in Australia with the first European settlers in 1788. Within 70 years, they'd spread across the continent. Not slowly, not in patches. They moved through deserts, through tropical forests, through alpine grasslands, through wetlands. By the time anyone was measuring the problem systematically, it was already everywhere. Today, feral cats have been recorded in 99.9% of Australia's total land area, including 80% of its offshore islands. There is essentially no corner of the continent they haven't reached. And they kill at a scale that is genuinely hard to hold in your head. A single feral cat in the Australian bush kills an average of 740 native animals per year. Every year, every cat. The combined feral cat population, which fluctuates between 2 million and 6 million individuals depending on rainfall and prey availability, kills more than 1.5 billion native animals annually. Birds, reptiles, mammals, frogs. That number is not a typo. 1.5 billion per year. Australia's Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water has confirmed that predation by feral cats is a recognized threat to over 200 nationally threatened species, but the kill count is almost secondary to the extinction record. Feral cats have contributed to the extinction of more than 20 Australian mammal species since European colonization. The pig-footed bandicoot, gone. The lesser bilby, gone. The broad-faced potteroo, gone. The desert bandicoot, gone. In total, Australia has lost 34 mammal species in under 250 years, a figure that represents the worst mammal extinction rate recorded anywhere on Earth, and cats sit at the centre of nearly every post-European case. As Professor Sarah Leger of the Australian National University has stated plainly, the feral cat has been a leading cause of at least 2/3 of Australia's mammal extinctions over the last 200 years. The animals that died weren't random. They were overwhelmingly small to medium-sized mammals, the kind that evolved on a continent that had no cat-like predator for millions of years. No feline-shaped pursuit hunter, no ambush predator in that body size. The bandicoot, the bettong, the bilby, these animals have no instinctive fear of something that moves the way a cat moves, strikes the way a cat strikes, or appears where a cat appears. They hadn't needed it. Evolution doesn't prepare species for threats that weren't there. So when cats arrived, it was over before the prey species even knew what was happening. The question that occupied wildlife managers for most of the 20th century was straightforward. How do you stop a predator that is already everywhere? The answers were blunt and expensive: shooting, trapping, poison baiting, including a controversial compound called 1080 and later a targeted bait called Eradicat, building physical exclusion fences, massive predator-proof enclosures where native animals could be rewilded inside a perimeter that kept cats out. Australia has spent hundreds of millions of dollars on these approaches. They work within limits. Inside the fences, native wildlife recovers. Outside them, the cats are still there, and fences can only cover so much ground. The continent is enormous. What ecologists were searching for, without quite saying so directly, was a biological answer. Not a fence, not a bait, something that operated at landscape scale. continuously, without a team of rangers and a government budget. Something the ecosystem could do on its own if given the chance. The first candidate was obvious. Australia has an apex predator. It's been here for at least 3,500 years. It hunts across the same deserts and scrublands where feral cats operate. It's large enough to kill a cat directly, and its presence alone should, in theory, alter the behavior of smaller predators. That animal is the dingo. And for more than a decade, a growing group of ecologists argued that protecting dingo populations, rather than the decades-long practice of poisoning and shooting them to protect livestock, might be one of the most powerful tools available for suppressing feral cats. The logic was ecological and well established in principle. It's called mesopredator suppression. When an apex predator is present in a landscape, it keeps populations of mid-sized predators in check, both through direct predation and through fear. Remove the apex predator, and the mesopredators explode. It had been documented in North America with coyotes and wolves, in Europe with foxes and lynx. The question was whether the dingo was playing that role for feral cats in Australia. A key piece of evidence came from the world's longest fence. The dingo fence, erected in the 1880s to protect sheep in New South Wales and Queensland from dingo attack, runs for over 5,600 kilometres across the continent, dividing landscapes that are otherwise nearly identical in habitat, rainfall and prey availability. On one side, dingoes. On the other, very few dingoes. In 2019, a team of researchers from UNSW Sydney published a study in the journal Ecosystems that used this fence as a natural experiment, comparing feral cat populations on both sides over 6 years. Their conclusion: dingoes drove down cat numbers and kept them down across the study period. The effect was real and measurable. A 2012 study from Charles Darwin University reinforced the picture from a different angle. Researchers at multiple sites across northern Australia found a consistent negative correlation between dingo activity and feral cat activity. Then, they experimentally reduced dingo abundance using poison baiting at a subset of those sites. Dingo activity fell 55% within 4 weeks. Cat activity, however, did not compensate by rising. There weren't more cats moving into the spaces dingoes had vacated. There were simply fewer cats in areas where dingoes had been active, suggesting it wasn't just behavioral avoidance, but something affecting cat abundance directly. That explanation was clean. It fit the theory. It pointed toward a policy response. Dial back dingo control in key areas and let the trophic cascade work in your favor. And then in 2023, a critical review of 30 years of research on the dingo-cat relationship was published in Biological Conservation and came to a very different conclusion. The review identified every study capable of rigorously assessing whether dingoes suppress feral cat and fox populations. It found 8, only 8 over 3 decades, that met the scientific standard required to make that claim. And each of those 8 showed the same result. They did not. The lead researcher, Dr. Ben Allen of the University of Southern Queensland, was direct about what this meant. The majority of research claiming that dingoes suppress cats did not have the scientific rigor to support those conclusions. The effect, where observed, may have been an artifact of the specific sites, conditions, or time frames studied, rather than a landscape-level phenomenon. In the same year, the Harry Butler Institute published a review of 157 Australian cat, fox and dingo diet studies, led by Professor Trish Fleming. Its finding: the diets of dingoes and feral cats don't overlap enough for direct dietary competition to suppress cat numbers. Dingoes and cats aren't competing for the same food in a way that would drive cats down. So the clean explanation, dingoes as the natural lever for cat control, is genuinely contested. It's not settled science. Some studies support it. Others, using more rigorous methods and longer time frames, find no effect. The landscape-level evidence is weak where it needs to be strongest. Which brings us to the animal that wasn't in the model at all. The Tasmanian devil is the world's largest living carnivorous marsupial. In terms of bite force relative to body size, it's among the most powerful of any mammal on Earth. It weighs up to 12 kilograms, hunts at night, communicates through a range of vocalizations that gave it its name, and plays a role in its ecosystem that researchers are still working to fully quantify. It is not subtle. When a Tasmanian devil arrives somewhere, other animals know. For the last 3,000 years, however, mainland Australia had none of them. The devil disappeared from the continent after the dingo was introduced from Southeast Asia. Dingoes hunt in packs. Devils don't cooperate. They were outcompeted, pushed south, and eventually survived only on Tasmania, separated from the mainland by the Bass Strait, which dingoes never crossed. What happened next on the mainland, in the absence of devils, followed the logic of mesopredator release. Without anything to check them, feral cats, and after European arrival, foxes moved into the top of the food chain in many ecosystems and have sat there ever since. The native prey species had evolved alongside devils and quolls and thylacines, not alongside cats, and the difference has been catastrophic. In Tasmania itself, researchers began documenting something alarming in the early 2000s. Contagious facial tumor cancer, devil facial tumor disease, the only known transmissible cancer in mammals other than a specific canine variant, was spreading through the devil population through biting and contact during feeding. By the 2020s, it had killed up to 90% of Tasmania's wild devils, reducing the population from around 150,000 animals to roughly 25,000. That collapse had consequences that reached far beyond the devil itself. Research published in Ecology Letters, led by Dr. Callum Cunningham at the University of Tasmania, tracked the relationship between devil abundance and feral cat abundance across Tasmania over years of data. The finding was stark. In areas where devil populations had collapsed due to the disease, feral cats were 58% more abundant, not somewhat more abundant, not marginally elevated, 58% more cats in places that had recently lost their devils. And where cats were more abundant, populations of the southern brown bandicoot, a small native marsupial, collapsed in turn. The mechanism wasn't primarily direct predation. Devils don't routinely eat cats. What they do is occupy the landscape in a way that makes cats behave differently. Feral cats in Tasmania are normally nocturnal or crepuscular, active at night and around dusk and dawn. When devil populations are healthy, cats shift their activity further toward dawn and dusk to avoid direct encounters with nocturnal devils. That behavioral shift, a few hours of repositioning in the daily schedule, turns out to matter enormously. The native species most at risk, bandicoots, small wallabies, native rodents, are precisely the animals that use the deepest part of the night. When cats are pushed away from that window by devil activity, those prey species gain meaningful protection. When the devils disappear and cats reclaim the night, the prey species follow. Dr. Cunningham's conclusion, shared by his team at the University of Tasmania: when Tasmanian devils are healthy and abundant, they suppress the abundance of feral cats. This, in turn, provides much-needed protection for vulnerable prey species such as bandicoots. The effect wasn't theoretical, it was documented, quantified, published. The question it immediately raised, and which Cunningham explicitly named in the paper, was whether bringing devils back to mainland Australia, where they'd been absent for 3 millennia, could reproduce it at a continental scale. On September 10, 2020, a door opened at a 400-hectare wildlife sanctuary in the Barrington Tops region of New South Wales, roughly 130 kilometres north of Sydney. 26 Tasmanian devils walked out of transport crates and into eucalyptus forest for the first time in 3,000 years on mainland Australian soil. The reintroduction was led by Aussie Ark in partnership with Wild and Wild Ark. It followed more than a decade of captive breeding specifically aimed at this moment. The animals were selected for genetic diversity and disease-free status. The sanctuary had been prepared, fenced to exclude feral predators, cleared of foxes and cats within the perimeter. The idea was to give the devils a foothold, let them breed, and monitor what happened to the broader ecosystem as they established. The results, in the years since, have been carefully documented, but cautiously framed. In 2023, Aussie Ark confirmed that Tasmanian devils at the Barrington Tops site were reproducing, the first joeys born in the wild on mainland Australia in 3,000 years. By that point, 21 additional adults had been released, and 16 joeys had been born at the site. The population was growing. What the site was also tracking was the cat response. David Hamilton, a devil researcher at the University of Tasmania, described the early behavioral data in straightforward terms. The presence of devils appears to unsettle feral cats. Cats that had previously operated nocturnally at the site were adjusting their activity windows. They weren't being eaten primarily, they were being made uncomfortable. That discomfort may be enough. According to the research from Tasmania, it doesn't take direct predation to produce measurable conservation benefits. It takes behavioral shift. Cats pushed into less optimal hunting windows protect the native species that depend on those windows. Here is where honesty requires a pause, because the scientific picture is not clean and no responsible account of it should pretend otherwise. The Barrington Tops reintroduction is still in its early stages. The sanctuary covers 400 hectares, meaningful for the animals inside it, but a tiny fraction of the Australian landscape where cats operate. Demonstrating a landscape-level effect from devil reintroduction at scale remains the critical unanswered question. The evidence from Tasmania is persuasive, but not directly transferable. Tasmania has no dingoes, different prey assemblages, a different baseline ecology. What works on an island with a 3,000-year history of devils may or may not produce the same effects on a mainland where cats have had centuries of unchallenged establishment. There are also researchers who raise a different concern. Tasmanian devils vanished from mainland Australia, in part because dingoes outcompeted them. Dingoes are still present across much of that landscape. Whether a reintroduced devil population can persist, breed and expand in environments that support dingo populations is an open question. The Barrington Top Sanctuary is fenced specifically because it needed to protect the early population from those dynamics. A broader release would face them directly. And then there is the complication that the researchers studying this rarely say loudly, but which sits underneath all of it. If devil reintroduction suppresses cats, what does it do to the other animals competing in that space? In Tasmania, devils that were placed on Macquarie Island to control cats also began consuming seabird eggs and chicks. Apex predators regulate ecosystems in ways that aren't always tidy. Reintroducing one is never a clean intervention with a single outcome. It is the beginning of a cascade, and cascades move in more than one direction. What the science currently says, honestly, without overstating either the evidence or the uncertainty, is this: where Tasmanian devils are present and abundant, feral cat activity decreases. Where feral cat activity decreases, vulnerable prey species show population recovery. The mechanism is primarily behavioral. The effect is real, documented across years of data in Tasmania, and significant enough that researchers at Australia's leading universities are now actively arguing for a mainland trial at meaningful scale. What the science cannot yet say is how far that effect reaches, whether it persists as devil populations expand beyond fenced sanctuary conditions, and whether it will work in mainland ecosystems that differ substantially from the Tasmanian baseline where the effect was measured. There is a layer to this story that goes deeper than the cat or the devil, and it's worth naming. Australia's feral cat problem was created by humans. Cats arrived on ships. They spread because colonization disrupted the ecosystems that might have slowed them. The native apex predators that might have checked them, the thylacine, the Tasmanian devil, populations of large quolls, were killed, displaced or driven to disease by human action. The landscape was cleared. Fire regimes were disrupted. The animals that remained were left without the ecological architecture they'd evolved alongside for millions of years. The dingo has been persecuted for over a century because it threatens livestock. The Tasmanian devil was exterminated from the mainland by a combination of dingo competition and human hunting before Europeans even arrived. The thylacine was hunted to extinction on the mainland thousands of years ago and on Tasmania by 1936. Every apex predator Australia had has been removed, reduced, or driven to the margins. And into that space, that ecological vacuum, the cat arrived and filled it perfectly. What is happening now at Barrington Tops and in the data coming out of Tasmania is something more than a conservation story about one animal. It is an early test of whether the logic that took decades and billions of dollars to understand in North America, where the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone produced cascading effects through the entire ecosystem, can be applied in Australian conditions to reverse a collapse that is, by every measure, the worst of its kind on Earth. The dingo case showed that the science isn't simple. The early evidence that apex predators suppress cats held up in some places and fell apart under rigorous scrutiny in others. The Tasmanian devil case shows something different. a mechanism that doesn't depend on direct competition or predation, but on the subtler, more pervasive effect of fear, of behavioral adjustment, of an animal being present in a landscape in a way that changes how every other animal in that landscape moves through time. That is harder to measure than a kill count. It is harder to quantify than a stomach content survey. But it may be the most ecologically powerful force available. Somewhere in the Barrington Tops right now, in eucalyptus forest, that hasn't heard a devil's call in 3 millennia, that experiment is running. The devils are breeding. The joeys are growing. The cameras set up around the sanctuary are capturing behavioral data that researchers are analyzing in ways that will eventually tell us whether what happened in Tasmania is reproducible at scale. The cats that were once the unchallenged predators in that patch of Nestabulas bush are, according to early reports, adjusting their schedules, pulling back from the nighttime window, seeding something they hadn't seeded in a very long time. Whether that adjustment expands into something large enough to matter for Australia's broader conservation crisis is not yet known. The scientists working on it do not claim certainty. The evidence from Tasmania is compelling, but not fully transferable. The questions about devil persistence in the presence of dingoes, about ecosystem-wide effects of adding a new apex predator to an already complex food web, about what happens to the cat population outside the fence boundaries, none of those are answered yet. What is known is that the conventional tools, shooting, trapping, baiting, fencing, are working inside the perimeters they cover and not beyond them. The continent is 7.7 million square kilometers. The fenced predator-free areas, as ambitious as they are, cover a fraction of that. Something that operates at landscape scale, continuously through biology rather than budget, is what the ecology has been asking for. And the 25,000-year evolutionary relationship between Australian prey species and the Tasmanian devil suggests that this particular animal already knows what to do once it's back where it belongs. The cat arrived 236 years ago and rewrote the ecology of an entire continent. The devil disappeared 3,000 years ago, and the ecology has been missing something ever since. Whether those two facts connect into a solution is the question now being tested in a 400-hectare patch of forest in the mountains of New South Wales. The experiment is running. The animals are doing what animals do when the pressure changes. The full answer is somewhere further along the timeline than we currently are. But for the first time in a long time, researchers are watching something in Australian conservation that looks less like managed retreat and more like the beginning of a reversal. If you've seen something unusual in the bush, behavior in native animals that doesn't match the pattern you expected, or anything that made you feel like the local ecology was shifting in a direction you couldn't explain, leave it in the comments. The data people send in from the field often extends the picture further than the official monitoring captures. And if this is the kind of story that stays with you, subscribe. The next chapter of the devil reintroduction is still being written and will be here when the data comes in. Sources referenced: DCCEEW Feral Cats Data, CSIRO Publishing, Cats in Australia, Legge Wojnarski Dickman 2019, Kennedy et al. Austral Ecology 2012, UNSW, Sydney Ecosystem Study 2019, Dr. Callum Cunningham et al. Ecology Letters, University of Tasmania, Allen et al. Biological Conservation 2023, Fleming et al. Royal Society Open Science 2022, Wild, Aussie Arc Barrington Tops, Reintroduction Reports 2020-2023, National Geographic, Smithsonian Magazine coverage of devil reintroduction.